So thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thanks to the president. Thanks for the students, and thanks to all the public. It's a pleasure and an honor to welcome B. Cavello at the Academy of Sciences of the Bologna Institute today. B is currently the Director of Emerging Technologies at the Aspen Institute. They received a Bachelor of Science in Economics from the University of Texas at Dallas, and were selected as an MIT Harvard Assembly Fellow for 2019 Ethics and Governance in Artificial Intelligence Initiative cohort. B in particular has been an advisor for the Senator Ron Wyden on issues, very important issues like privacy, internet governance, and algorithmic accountability through the Congressional Innovation Fellowship. Nowadays, B, I read from the CV, which is online, is a technology and facilitation expert, passionate about creating social change by empowering everyone to participate in technological and social governance. In the recent Aspen meeting on ethics and artificial intelligence that was held in Venice a few days ago and promoted, among others, by our academy, B reported in a very brilliant way, matter of facts, on the status of the interrelations among three main actors, which are people, politics, and artificial intelligence. The relation among these three actors is crucial. Trust was the main theme of B discussion. Trust, indeed, is the central theme of discussion, one of the central themes of discussion, because it's going to determine how healthy is going to be the growth of AI among us. It's also worth to remember, and this is a personal anecdote that I share with the audience on artificial intelligence meeting. It's really worth to remember that in the world, there are associations against artificial intelligence. In particular, the French, l'Association Française contre l'intelligence artificielle. Did you know it exists? I have personally witnessed, a few years ago, an encounter among the president of such association in France. It is a highly cultivated person. He comes from the École Polytechnique. And my distinguished colleague, Cédric Villani, which is a Fields medalist, a Nobel Prize in mathematics, and also he sits in the French Parliament, okay? So Cédric and this president, in a sort of Facebook debate, Facebook talk show, it was held at École Normale, but it was transmitted in real time in Facebook, faced this colloquium, and the president of the Association contre l'intelligence artificielle asked him, Cédric, do you agree to put a limit to the intelligence of machines? And we were puzzled by the question. And Cédric, of course, said something like, as a mathematician, I cannot put any limit on what I cannot measure. Intelligence cannot be measured. And the president answered, you are in charge of the guide of the development of AI in this country, and you don't even know how to control and measure artificial intelligence. And the president of that association gained all the public support. All the hearts were popping out in the Facebook transmission and thumbs up from every person in the public. This little event make us wonder, okay? So the presence of B today, with their fresh view on the US situation, has a twofold meaning. First, it means that we, as an academy, we are eager to learn what's next, and we are going to matter on what's next. Academies, indeed, as our president points out very often, are recovering and gaining back their original ancient role, the role of being the guide of society in periods of quick changes like the period we are living right now. So with us today, there are also two distinguished colleagues of mine at the University of Bologna, Michela and Giusella. Michela Milano is a professor of computer science and the director of the Alma AI Center for Artificial Intelligence. Giusella Finocchiaro is professor of private law and internet law, and also the president of Del Monte Foundation in Bologna and Ravenna. Well, now the floor to B.
Thank you so much. It is such a joy and a pleasure to be here today. I'm grateful to the Academy and to everyone showing up here in person as well as online. It is a tremendous honor to get to speak with you as well as to be in this beautiful space that we are getting to share right now. So we are going to see a little bit of tension, I think, including what was just shared. That's perfect. It's okay if it's up. Including what was just shared in that anecdote, and I'm very grateful for the kind introduction. So today we will talk about the future of AI, which is a big topic. You know, people often ask me, especially as the director of emerging technologies, you know, what does the future of AI look like? What will it include? Will we have super intelligent artificial beings? Will we have autonomous vehicles driving on the roads? Will we have smart cities that can adapt and move according to the weather patterns? Will we have a future that looks like a utopia, or will we have a future that looks like a dystopia? And something that I like to say is, right now, the future of AI looks like blue faces looking to the right. When we talk about AI, this is what we tend to see. Blue faces looking to the right. In fact, this is an AI's version of AI. This was generated by OpenAI's DALL-E model, a generative image model. And given the prompt, the future of AI, it came up with this, frankly, I think somewhat depressing vision of what the future of AI looks like. Now, I don't like to make predictions about the future of AI. It's very difficult. Many brilliant people before me, including, as was alluded to, very storied scholars have tried to make predictions about AI and gotten them very wrong. We have Nobel Prize winners and Turing Award winners who've had very ambitious ideas about what the future of AI would look like. And technology in general is very hard to predict. It has all of these somewhat chaotic and emergent relationships. And, you know, sometimes even something as ubiquitous as the internet was once believed to catastrophically collapse. Although, depending on your point of view, perhaps this was a correct, adequate assumption. So when we think about these predictions, this was a graph put together by some researchers from the Future of Humanity Institute and Singularity Institute. We can see that there have been many predictions made about when we might see this so-called human-level intelligence in AI. And the guesses are all over the map. They're always a little bit in the future. We can graph according to the year the prediction was made. Sometimes quite a bit into the future and sometimes quite nearby. This graph was made on data that only went up to 2012. So admittedly, these data are 10 years old already now. So I apologize for not having a more recent data set. But here's where we are now, where I am being asked, what does the future look like? And I don't know. Now, part of why this is tricky is because we don't all agree on what we're talking about when we say AI. Frequently, you'll see an image that looks like this one, where we have the overarching umbrella of artificial intelligence, and a subset of that is machine learning, and a subset of that is deep learning. Now, some people disagree and say, well, you know, machine learning isn't always AI, and actually it's a lot more complicated than that. But not only are we in disagreement about what artificial intelligence is, as was alluded to, we're not in agreement about what intelligence is. There was a time when people thought, well, anything that can master the game of chess, that is truly intelligent. Well, in 1997, we had Deep Blue that beat the reigning chess master, Garry Kasparov. It didn't seem like that was true intelligence. Then people said, well, you know, chess, that's all kind of measured and programmatic. Maybe we need something that's a little bit more human, more narrative. And people thought, well, if an artificial intelligence can compete at a knowledge-based game like Jeopardy, that is true intelligence. And again, in 2011, a system was built that could compete that way. IBM's Watson system competed on Jeopardy and won. There's some disagreement about the little modifications to the rules to make that available, but clearly that wasn't what people were talking about when they said true intelligence. But, you know, remembering facts or, you know, playing chess, which has been studied for hundreds of years and has many sort of play-by-play rule books, perhaps that's not it. Perhaps true intelligence is more intuitive. Perhaps there's something like the game of Go, which, you know, requires a much kind of looser sense of what is an immediate gain or loss and a lot more long-term strategy. Again, in 2016, we had this system, the AlphaGo system, which defeated then the Dan 9 player Lee Sedol, and then went on in the following year, 2017, to beat the top ranked player at the time. Most of us would agree that those systems were not the true intelligence that many of us are talking about when we talk about this human level AI. Now, even just this year, there have been some very exciting announcements for capabilities in generative language models and generative image models that, frankly, if you'd asked me just 5 years ago, I probably would have said, probably not yet. And yet here we are in 2022, and we see incredible performance from these models. They're able to do things that are very impressive, even to the extent that some of the people who are testing them begin to question, is this that true intelligence? I don't think so personally, but your mileage may vary. What I do think is that when we think about these systems, we need to think about the ways in which we are, you know, making some assumptions and also open to making mistakes. And so I don't like to make predictions about what the future of AI will look like. But this is a future of AI talk, so I am going to make some predictions about what the future of AI will look like. And I will do so with this in mind. This is one of my favorite web comics of all time. It is a comic that has an artist that is sitting there afraid to put their pencil to the page saying, I'm too afraid to make mistakes. And their cat, their friend beside them says, mess up on purpose. And they do, and it's beautiful. So in that spirit, I'm going to make some predictions today, and I hope that some of these predictions will be wrong. Who am I to be talking to you here? Well, I had a very kind introduction, so I will not repeat myself too much, but I am currently working as the Director of Emerging Technologies at the Aspen Institute. The Aspen Institute is a global nonprofit organization that was founded after the end of the Second World War. And what we do is we bring together people, thinkers, creators from all around the world to work on these big problems and to talk with each other and to share ideas and to foster diplomacy and collaboration. What my team specifically in Aspen Digital does is focus that energy toward how humanity can be responsible stewards of technology and media. As was mentioned, prior to this role, I was working in the United States Congress. I worked for Senator Ron Wyden as a tech policy advisor. I had the great privilege of getting to work on a bunch of different really exciting topics, one of which was the Algorithmic Accountability Act. It is one of the most well-known AI regulations or potential laws, not yet a law, in the United States. This process was incredibly eye-opening to me, having not worked in government and not actually had the responsibility of turning ideas into legal text. And I have so much respect for lawyers now with that in mind. And before that, I had worked in the AI and governance space for a few years. I had done the fellowship between MIT and Harvard. I also had worked at the Partnership on AI as a program lead there. I was focused on primarily issues relating to AI's impact on labor and the economy, both the ways in which technology is changing our economy such that there might be automation affecting employment, but also who are those workers behind the scenes making all of our AI models possible. I also worked at IBM, creators of Deep Blue and Watson, which was an extraordinary experience. And I got to work with people who are doing some really interesting thinking at the leading edge of the hardware connection to these technologies. But when we think about the future of AI, most of us who work in this space don't find this vision particularly exciting. We got into these spaces because we believed in what these technologies could do, what they could create, what kinds of worlds we could live in that would be made possible with the help of these tools. We wanted to see beautiful visions, not blue faces looking to the right. We want worlds that are full of diversity and collaboration. We want places where people can thrive and have agency. And I do believe that these technologies can help us to achieve some of these goals. I think that the future of AI could be quite bright. It may be a wonderful place. It also might not be. It may have some issues. And I want to talk about some of the issues that I see playing out in this space. And I know there's a lot of talk about ways in which we need to be responsible with AI. And I hope today that I will share with you a couple of things that perhaps you haven't encountered before. So the three themes that I want to explore here, some of my predictions I hope will be wrong, are a world that we are creating with these technologies that is more distrustful, more concentrated in its power relationships, and less accountable to everyday people. So let's start with distrust. What does this look like? Well, an interesting example that I think that maybe today wouldn't be considered AI is this one. In the United States, there is a process of creating regulations, creating rules in the federal government that involves public comments. People can write in and say what they feel about an issue. It's an important part of our democratic process that not only can people vote, but they can also make their voices heard. This issue in particular was the issue of whether or not companies that provide internet services, ISPs, internet service providers, could change the rate at which certain data flows depending on what website you're visiting. So if you want to visit Netflix, perhaps they can pay extra to the ISP so that your data moves really quickly. But if you want to access a nonprofit website like Wikipedia, maybe not. This was a really big issue in the United States, and it was something that many, many groups stood up to campaign for and defend. And this issue received millions of comments. What you might notice on the screen here is that some of these comments look a little bit similar. Some of them have very similar sentence structure. Now, sometimes it is true that advocacy groups will rally a bunch of people to write in about an issue they care about, and it might be a little formulaic. But millions of these, that's a bit unusual. Well, one researcher, Jeff Cow, did an analysis like this one, labeling these semantically similar chunks of text here, and basically put forward a theory that these pieces of text are essentially Mad Libs. They're programmatically generated. They are filling in the blank with similar sounding language, choosing from a list and randomizing the order so that we get all of these wonderful variants that we see here. Jeff expected that there might be over 1 million of said comments. When the agency did an investigation of the 22 million comments that were received, over 80% of them, perhaps more, were found to be fake. In fact, a good chunk of them, over 1 million, were generated by what is believed to be one 19-year-old man, which is pretty impressive, but also a little frightening, not very democratic. Our public systems are, by and large, not designed to deal with this sort of generative text capacity. Now, what you've probably heard before is that this has some scary implications for what we see online. This has some scary implications for the information and the media that we consume. This is definitely true. One of the possible outcomes of these technologies is fake news, is misinformation and disinformation online that is being created with these generative systems, sometimes intentionally to mislead, sometimes just to score more advertising revenue. But suffice to say, it's not very good for democracies. But I want to take it another step further. Let's say we recognize fake news is a problem. Well, that's concerning. What might we do about it? Well, some people have proposed there should be some sort of validation that you have to do. Maybe you have to prove that this information is coming from a trustworthy source. Maybe you have to have some sort of embedded metadata in an image or video file to show that it is original and not tampered with. Those might sound like good ideas, but they also come with a cost. There's a really wonderful organization called Witness. They do a lot of work with on-the-ground documentary coverage of all kinds of events, wars, and human rights abuses around the world. And they put cameras and streaming and video equipment into the hands of people on the ground who are experiencing those situations so that they can tell the world what is happening. Very frequently, the people who are most marginalized, the poorest people, the people whose governments are most hurtful to them, they don't have the capacity to prove that their stuff is legit. They can't show that they are from a reputable source. That doesn't mean that the stories they're telling aren't valuable. Taking it even one level deeper, well, we say, well, maybe there can be some other system to validate. Maybe there can be some sort of connectedness to your reputation. You know, if you share something once that's wrong, so it goes. But if you're millions of times sharing something wrong, well, that's something to be concerned about. Maybe so. But these types of identity systems run the risk of us sacrificing a lot of our personal data and privacy to whomever it is that's validating, whether it be a government system or a private institution. Personally, this isn't the future I want to live in. Another prediction I have around AI has to do with the concentration of power. One of the things that's most common to do with AI systems is personalize experiences. It's a very popular idea. We talk about personalization in online shopping, in healthcare, in so many different situations. And personalization could be a really great thing, right? I'm really interested in disability justice. And being able to know what someone's preferred contrast level of colors is, or size of text, or other issues like this, could really help empower people. But there's also a dark side to personalization. Now, we're going to go on a little field trip here, and I will beg forgiveness from any economists in the room who I will make a mistake after being out of school for several years. But hopefully I can get this basic one right. Here is your classic supply and demand graph. And I think I can use, oh, yes. So, right, when we have not a lot of, when we have a high price, we have not a lot of demand. When the price comes down, more people can afford to buy it. There could be more demand. It's kind of confusing because in economics, we switch the axes on the graph. Similarly, when the price is low, not a lot of people want to sell or supply or produce. But when the price is high, a lot of people want to supply. Now, normally what happens in this is that we look at where these two lines intersect, and we say that is the market price. The market decides where these two things intersect, and we're able to say, okay, well, some suppliers won't sell, some buyers won't buy, but a lot of people are benefiting. Below the price are all these suppliers who would have been producing anyway, but because they're getting that market price, now they're getting all of this producer surplus. And up here are consumers who would have bought at a very, very high price, but the price isn't that high, so they're getting all of this consumer surplus. Now, this is something that a lot of us have come to essentially assume and rely upon about markets, that we're going to have this intersection of supply and demand, occasionally adjusted a bit from, potentially some, price rules or imports and exports. But ultimately, there's this idea that everyone wins a bit by having this intersection happen. Well, what this assumes is that that person who wanted something, even though it had a really high price, that they still got to buy it at this price. But in a world of extreme personalization, what we would call perfect price discrimination, we lose that consumer surplus. Now, the suppliers capture all of that benefit, because if you're desperate and you're willing to buy it, even if it's really expensive, they can sell it to you for that price, and you might never know that other people are getting a different price. Perhaps don't think of this as you getting a higher price. Think of it as everyone else getting a sale that you were excluded from. This can be kind of concerning, because when we lose that consumer surplus, we lose the ability to make choices about when and what we buy, and we begin to give a lot more power to the companies who are producing whatever it is that we're buying. This is a graph showing the amount of compute used over time in kind of the top of the line machine learning or AI models. We can see that up until the early 2010s, it was a kind of shallow line. This is approximating the line that you would see from Moore's law, the idea that compute, the amount of transistors on a chip is going to be increasing at this predictable rate. Well, what we can clearly see is that around the time that deep learning really took off in 2012 or so, there is a tremendous jump in the amount of compute being thrown at these problems. This is because it is so beneficial to have more compute. It allows you to do so much more when you can process so much more data. And that's why many of the top leaders in this space are people like Google, organizations like Google, that have access to lots and lots of data and lots of computing. You know, it used to be at the beginning of this machine learning revolution in the last 10 years that you could be building models on your laptop and get some pretty state-of-the-art results. Those days are essentially over now. If you want to train models, you're going to be looking at massive data centers, hours and hours of compute time. It's becoming incredibly expensive in the millions of dollars to train state-of-the-art machine learning models. This I present as a concern in light of what we were just seeing, because what this means is that the number of players, the number of producers that can capture this surplus is shrinking. The number of choices that exist will shrink. Now, again, hopefully some of these predictions are wrong. But when we see this, we might begin to see, in fact, perhaps many of us would say we already see around the world, a few standout players that are capturing a lot of the gains from these increases in machine learning capabilities as we head toward artificial intelligence. The third issue that I want to bring to you is the lack of accountability. Now we're looking at this world where, we have these systems that can generate millions and millions of comments, create images and text that's incredibly believable. We also have potentially a concentration of players who can really work at the cutting edge to be able to predict things about the future and about our lives, like our purchasing habits. And that dwindling number of players means that there may be more and more power being amassed behind them. Now, I want to tell a little story. This is a story some of you may be familiar with. It's a story by Mark Twain called A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Now, I'll leave out some of the details of this story, but essentially what happens is this man here in the tree gets transported back in time, back to King Arthur's time, and he is finding himself in this strange world of knights and kings and people. Merlin is there. It's a whole story. But he comes up with an idea. He knows, because he's lived in the future, that on the date, a couple days ahead of him, there will be a solar eclipse. Now, he doesn't believe at first that he's even transported in time, but he knows that there's not going to be an eclipse a couple days from where he's supposed to be in time, but from where he's transported to, there is supposed to be an eclipse. And so he says, okay, I know that the only total eclipse of the sun that occurred in this part of time that I'm supposedly in happened on this date. So he begins to think, all right, I'll wait around, I'll see what happens, and then I'll be able to know if I'm really in that point in time. Well, a lot of things happen. He ends up in a not so great situation, and he ends up being tied to the stake to be burned because of all of the crazy future talk that he's telling people about. But as he knows, there is a solar eclipse coming, and he uses that knowledge about the future to help him out. As he's tied to the stake, or as he's in this messed up situation, he says, go back and tell the king that in an hour, I will smother the whole world in a dead blackness of night. I will blot out the sun. Now, we all know that he doesn't have the power to do this, and we, the readers, know there's a solar eclipse coming whether he says this or not. But the people around him don't. And as the hour approaches and the sky darkens, everyone is terrified of this incredible sorcerer who has the power to shroud the entire world in darkness. We are living in a time where, through this concentration of capabilities and through this tremendous noise and uncertainty about what the truth is, there might be just a few players who can predict the future that we all are asked to rely upon and to believe. And they may use that power, that great sorcery, in ways that serve us, but they also might not. And we may not have the means to hold them accountable. So the future I presented is not so great. It's one where people can hardly trust each other or the information they see in the world. One where power is increasingly concentrated, and the powers that be may have access to knowledge that none of us are able to check. You know, I've been thinking recently, and I won't pretend to know this historically, so I'll wonder if anyone in the audience here knows, but I believe we might be living right now, or we were maybe, let's say 20 years ago, at the time when the greatest proportion of the human population on Earth had the ability to read and write, the ability to get information and hear it from multiple sources potentially, and to be able to validate that the information that someone has said is true, as compared to, for instance, when people relied upon the church to translate everything for them, to interpret the word of God, and they couldn't read Latin, so they said, well, I guess the priest is right, I guess the Pope is right, I guess that's how it is. And we might be living in an era where that little window in humanity is coming to a close, where our ability to check the work of the people in power is beginning to escape us again. I hope this isn't the case. Now, I do have one potentially unusual source of hope, which is that the future is awfully unpredictable. It's really hard. People have been trying and trying and trying, but it is really, really tough. Even things that we know are going to happen, like a global pandemic, we don't know when they're going to happen. And there's this concept that's been introduced of the black swan event. The black swan event is something that was completely unforeseen, something that hitherto was basically thought impossible, wasn't necessarily even in the realm of possibilities of something that could even be considered impossible or not. It was something else entirely. And yet, when it appears, it shifts our idea of what the possibility space looks like. It shifts our idea of what is possible. This is something that maybe is interesting as we're thinking about these machine learning models that learn off of historical data and project forward in time. In fact, many machine learning models struggled in the last couple of years because they weren't built for a pandemic world. They weren't built for people going around wearing masks. They weren't built for people stopping going on airplanes and so forth. So sometimes these events might occur. In fact, I would go one level further. When we think about data, it is not a full picture of everything that is happening. We're not capturing that, at least not yet. And frankly, I kind of hope that we never do. But it is only a piece of the story of what we see. It is just a part of that full-bodied swan. And I think that when we make predictions, when we extrapolate forward, we sometimes come up with these kind of grotesque distortions of the idea of what the future looks like. This is an artist's depiction. They do essentially speculative paleontological drawing, where they say, well, based on these bones, what sort of dinosaur would we have drawn? Well, this doesn't really look like those fluffy black swans that we saw earlier. Now, I think this is a good thing, and I think it's a bad thing, right? It means there's a strong incentive to collect more data, to have a more full picture. But it also is a recognition that there's always noise in the system, there's always chaos, and this ability to predict what will come is perhaps flawed. But on the other hand, I also want to recognize that sometimes when we do have this flawed vision of what is going to come, we also might have this habit of propagating things forward. If any of us has struggled with using a autocorrect in typing a text message, you may have experienced this. Sometimes our technologies are so eager to take our past data and push it forward onto the future that they come up with words that we never really wanted to say. Something that concerns me about our incorporation of more and more of these predictive technologies into our lives is that we might essentially be locking ourselves in to the status quo we have today. This is something I thought a lot about when I worked in Congress. You know, when you work in the government, in the legislature, when you're coming up with the laws, you try to write laws that will be enforceable and that people can follow. And you might imagine, what would the world look like if this law were perfectly enforced? But throughout our history, it is because laws have not been perfectly enforced that we have been able to progress, that we've been able to have creative new ways of doing things, that we've been able to have rights as communities who maybe have not had those rights before. It is because of imperfect enforcement of rules that we are able to experiment. And I think it's very important, recognizing the somewhat terrifying picture that our incomplete view might give us, that we not project this onto the future with such precision that we don't have room to do something new. So what does the future of AI look like? Well, could be spooky blue faces looking to the right, or it could be all of these wonderful things about human flourishing that we want to achieve. Ultimately, these are some more generated images. It's up to us to decide what we're going to research, what we're going to code, what we're going to create, what we're going to put into products. Ultimately, at least for now, the power is in our hands, and it's important that we act upon that. Now, before I close, I do want to call out one really cool initiative. It's called Better Images of AI. What they were trying to do is, well, it's on the tin, create better images of AI. So we have fewer spooky blue faces and more inventive images for what AI is. Maybe it's the hardware, maybe it's the models that we depict, maybe it's the people working on it. Ultimately, I think that there's so much opportunity still, especially for those of us in academic and creative and technological communities, to shape this future and to make really beautiful things happen. And I hope that at least what I've shared today will be somewhat wrong, so we have room to make mistakes and learn along the way. Thank you.
Thank you, B, for this broad view of possible futures in front of us. There are questions. This is a good moment, and I would like also to invite the colleagues sitting here with me, because they're going to talk next. Question from the audience in presence or the audience online. Please.
Roberto Tuberosa, thank you very much for your talk, very interesting. I belong to the baby boom generation, like many of us. And being a professor at the university, I see a terrible decline in the capacity of young students to think how my generation used to. And sometimes I think, is it because they don't read enough books, and which is a topic that has been raised in Italy and in Europe several times. So my question to you, to what extent do you think that the young generation have the tools to approach and manage appropriately the problems that very nicely you have laid out that will definitely affect our future? And will they have the tools, enough critical tools? Because I do see, and I'm not sure if my colleague share my view, I see a decline in the capacity of young students to think of, or perhaps because I look in different ways, the way we used to. And I wondered, again, my question to you, do you think that the lack of reading books somehow negatively affects the young generation? Or do you think that's some thought that is being brought around? So if you want to comment, I thank you very much on that.
Yes, thank you for that. I will come out as a self-professed not book reader. I don't read that many books, so I'm perhaps guilty as part of that group. I'll be biased in saying I don't think that's the issue. I think there is something to be said for, and there are cognitive scientists, perhaps in this bunch, who will be able to speak more to how consuming long form content versus the short types of content that many of us now receive affects the way that we process information. But I actually have tremendous optimism for what I see happening in groups of young people. Something that I've observed is that a lot of young people today are incredibly collaborative and resourceful with their collaborations. They have grown up alongside the internet, sometimes in ways that may frustrate us, everyone copying off of each other's homework or sharing a Google Doc to take notes. But that could be a beautiful thing, right? That's the world that they are coming into. You know, there are some people who, you know, when I was in high school, there were people whose parents didn't want them to have a cell phone. And there were people whose parents let them have a cell phone. And I think the people who were not allowed, their parents were thinking, you know, this is maybe frivolous, or this is going to be a distraction. But in many ways, the tools that they had access to when they did have those technologies, those were the tools of the future. Those were the tools that actually, to succeed in the world, they needed to know and to master. And so I think that there are ways in which, because technology is shifting quickly, and again, I hate to make these predictions, but I do think that there is a world in which the way that we solve problems and the way that we think about things may be evolving. And it may be that the tools that we see, you know, whether people are streaming video games on Twitch or creating viral TikTok videos or whatever the case may be, it may be that those tools are actually the tools of mass mobilization, of information dispensing in the future, and that by mastering those tools, they are actually in service. I don't think that that means that we should give up on the ways that we've been learning to think in the past. In fact, I think that there's a wonderful way to try to infuse these things together. But as I mentioned at the top, as someone who doesn't read a lot of books, I have thought about how many words I consume every day looking at, for instance, a Twitter feed. And I have not yet built a script to do this, but I wanted to compare. You know, there are people who read a book a week. So much admiration for that. But maybe I am reading a book a week. It's just spread out across a bunch of different authors. And I think that that new way of interacting with information and of synthesizing information is its own superpower. I do think that there is a concern about the ability to go deep and to stay persistent with something. But I also recognize that maybe that's not what the world calls for at this moment in time. So I think that the tools exist. I don't know that everyone is using them critically. And I think that, to me, that's the bigger concern. It's by all means, we should have as many tools at our disposal for communicating with each other and sharing knowledge. But to be able to interact with those tools in a critical fashion, you know, whether it means thinking about the interests of a scientific publisher and whether they're really in the interest of, you know, serving humanity or not, there's always a good, an appropriate critical lens to apply. And so I think that that's just as true for these new technologies and new tools as it is for the book publishers and the journal publishers of the past and present.
Other questions? Well, if not, I'd like to add just a very, very short comment on the B answer to the same question, because you may probably know that when books started to be popular, there were philosophers that were criticizing both the writing and the reading of books. And well, now the point is that, for instance, Socrates said, well, when you read a book, you have a question and the book doesn't answer. So why should we write books? And others said, books are going to ruin us because if you write things on a book, then you do not, let's say, exercise your memory. And the man without memory is a dead man. Okay, those objections were in principle correct. But as you see, the writing of books didn't let us lose our memory and didn't forbid us to grow. Actually, books now are literature, are art. So I share the same positive optimism that B has on this use of new technology. It's probably because we were born in the baby boomer time that we see these things with a bit of suspicion, but we have the duty of the optimism. That's what I think.
I'll just add to that though, to contradict perhaps myself a little bit. I think that those concerns that we would forget or lose certain ways of remembering are also true. There have been many languages erased in the process of standardizing written language. There have been many ways of knowing and understanding the world that have been lost through new technologies. And so I think it is absolutely fair to look critically at the changes that are coming and to question, what do we lose when we gain this thing? It's not to say that it's not worthwhile or that certain tools aren't appropriate for certain things, but I 100% also do want to emphasize that we have lost things. We've lost knowledge to history because it was remembered through song, and we don't have those songs anymore, or it was remembered through a location in a forest and we don't have those forests anymore. So I think that it is worth asking, what do we lose, even though I am ultimately at least 51% optimistic about where technology is taking us.
Thank you, B. So if there are no other questions, I would leave the floor to my colleagues and Michela.
Okay, so first of all, I mean, great talk, a great perspective, and so I would like really to start from the last slide that you have posted, that is basically that the future of technology in general is in our hands, right? So, you know, I mean, indeed, there have been many super interesting results in AI these days, like even superhuman performances in machine vision or in natural language understanding and processing, speech translation. So we are really, I mean, boosting the technology, and we are really, you know, reaching points that were even, you know, I mean, it was quite impossible to think about all these achievements in such a short time, because also the pace in which technology is growing is unbelievable. So but I really think that we need to, also for me, it's difficult to predict the future, and I also don't like doing that, but still I can see something that is not working properly now and on which we can work for making it better. So there are a few things that are, that I think that we have to work on, and the first part is trust. And because basically these systems are going to, you know, take decision for us. And if a system has to take a decision for me, I have to trust the system, of course. And every time we propose a solution to a company or to a policymaker that involves technology, the first thing that they do is, I don't trust it, okay? So there should be ways that are not just, I mean, technology development, but are also, you know, working around technology, but with people that are experts in communications, for example, that are experts in social sciences, that are experts in humanities, that really help us bring in the technology to the people that have to use it, right? The users of the technology. So that's the first thing. And for doing that, we also need to work on what trust can mean also in the from a technological perspective. So for example, a system needs to be trustworthy in terms of explainability. Okay? So a system takes a decision for me, so I want to understand at least why the decision has been suggested to me. So a system should be able to be explainable and explain what are the steps to reach a given decision, which is not easy to do. A system should be fair, for example, so the decision that has been taken by the system should be, not biased, but data, for example, are biased. And sometimes systems learn from us. And are we really a good example for the system? I mean, there is this, the example of the Thai chatbot that has been switched off after 48 hours. This chatbot was learning from tweets, and basically after 48 hours, it has became misogynist and racist and violent. And why that? Because it was learning from us, from our conversations on Twitter, which is, I mean, crazy, right? So the thing is that we really need to take into account all these trustworthy dimensions, I would say, in our development of the technology. And there is a lot of work in Europe now. So the European Commission has delivered these trustworthy AI guidelines. And we are now working to understand how to translate these trustworthy AI guidelines in practice, because nobody knows how to do that, right? So companies, policy, public sectors, and even researchers. So there is a huge amount of research on that. The second thing that I would like to mention is about, accessibility of the technology. So now AI is just accessible by experts. AI experts. And we have talked a lot about with small and medium enterprises, with companies in general, and also to the public sector. And they don't know what they don't know. So they don't even know what they can do with AI. So there is a tremendous need for first make these systems more accessible in terms of technology. So for example, increasing and improving the interaction with humans, right? For example, with natural language interaction and natural language conversations. But the second thing that we have to do is really to work on education and awareness. So we have to make people aware of what we can do with AI, what they cannot do with AI, what are the risks if it is misused, and what are the advantages that we can achieve in case we use this technology properly. Because indeed AI has a great potential of improving our life in the future. So at least the potential is there, because it can, first of all, help us, also solving sustainability related problems that are very big, very large in scale and complexity. So like, the management of natural resources, of water, energy, but also cities, our life can be improved by artificial intelligence that can manage a huge amount of data, that can manage, that can support decisions. So we can really, have benefits. So this technology can be used for our benefit, but we have to be aware of what are the risks if it is misused, because I mean, as B showed us, there are risks, of course, because AI is becoming really powerful and can really, for example, create fake news, fake videos, fake everything. So it can really guide the public opinion. So it's really important that we are aware of these risks. But I mean, I'm most optimistic that I mean, our future will be better with technology than without, if we are able to govern it properly. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, Vi, for being here and for your inspiring talk. I also, as Michela did, go back to your last slide. The future is up to us. And my perspective is a very peculiar one, because I am a professor of law and a lawyer, as you have been in the past. And so the answer for me is what is going to be done by the questions, for me are two. What is going to be done by the legislator? What should be done by legislators all over the world? So from my perspective, what I see now is the world is divided more or less in three regions, China, US, and Europe. China has an approach which is, of course, driven basically by the government. US has an approach driven basically by the market. And European Union is trying to formulate an approach based on regulation. We are, first of all, regulators. We do not produce technology, as someone says, we produce regulation. I don't know if it's good or not. I tend to think that it's not very good, but in any case, this is the output at the moment we do produce. And the second question is, being aware of that, what should be done by legislators? Well, first of all, I think that the approach should be globally coordinated. If it's true that European is going to produce regulation, this regulation should be shared, at least shared with Chinese actors and US actors. Some European legislation has been replicated by Chinese government. For instance, the GDPR has been framed in a Chinese version and is very similar to GDPR in Europe. But in substance, the approach is really different. So I think at least with US, we should engage a fruitful and substantial dialogue and try to have a regulation, in common. How can be done? Well, you mentioned in your talk distrust. And as you may know, recently has been approved a code on a couple of days ago. It was approved a code on fake news and fake information. And this approach is very interesting because it was a co-regulated approach. So not only legislators, but also platforms and associations, civil associations, participated into the writing of the code. And so the code was the product of an intensive dialogue of among different actors. I think this could be a way, at least in order to formulate basic principles, but then the question stays, the question posed by Michela, how do we traduce in practice high principles stated in the law? And I'd like to know your opinion on that. If you think that the European approach is a good approach, if we are regulating too much. As you know, in the proposal for artificial intelligence, in the Artificial Intelligence Act, there is a lot of regulation, maybe too much. It's very strict, and it basically is based on the present situation without giving space for the future development, and is a very wrong approach. When you are regulating technology, you should be technology neutral. But in any case, I'd like to have your opinion overall. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both for those comments. And I think it speaks to your humility that when you were saying, China is driven by government, US is driven by market, you didn't say Europe is driven by a rights-based approach. You said by regulation. So you could sell it better. This principles to practice question is something that has been, probably one of the prevailing topics in the responsible and trustworthy AI space over the last 5 years, and it is still not solved. It is a very tough question. It's easy to agree that things should be fair and trustworthy. It's hard to actually agree on what that means, and that's part of why I have such tremendous respect for lawyers, because, when I was working in the US Senate, the words that I wrote down could become law that might be there for 50 or 100 or more years. That's kind of terrifying. Now I understand why lawyers care so much about punctuation, because it really, really matters, right? Someone far into the future might be interpreting what you say and they might not know what you meant at the time. And this is actually something that I see as a downfall a lot with many of the civil society groups and advocates that I work with. When I worked for Senator Wyden, I would meet with advocates coming to talk to me about responsible AI. And they would say a bunch of things I agree with and that my boss agreed with. I would be like, great, we all agree. You don't need to convince me. What I need help with is what words can we write down? Because we'll use a lot of phrases in this space, like stakeholder engagement. What's stakeholder engagement mean? Well, you can really stipulate it out. Sometimes you have to, but that can be too rigid. Or you can leave it mushy, and then you might have a government interpreting that in a new way that does something that you didn't really want with it. So I think that as we have these conversations around principles and practice, first we just need to own the fact that there is a degree of ambiguity in all of these phrases, and we need to try our hardest to get specific and to talk specifically. There's this idea of tabooing the word. When you taboo the word, what you're doing, you're saying you're not allowed to say that word anymore. You're not allowed to say AI anymore. What do you mean? Is AI specifically deep learning? Well, does it account for, maybe these more grammatical based models? When you taboo the word, that can be one way to help to get down to the specifics of what the conversation is about. So what I think on one side we need is for advocates and actors who are trying to push things in a more trustworthy and responsible direction. I think that you have to take a hard look at the language you're using and say, how can I make this specific? How can I make this something that could be written down and 50 years from now, someone would interpret it and it would still mean what I meant it to say? On the other side, I do think that there is a concern about over-regulating and over-regulating to the present. This is something I observed in the United States as well. In the United States, people are really upset about Facebook and Meta, and for good reason, right? There's some not so great stuff going on over there. But what you see time after time is all of these bills being written that are basically just about Facebook. Like it says a company, but it really just means Facebook. And people will try to define the company so that it basically just covers Facebook. And that's just not a very good way to write laws. I know people have a lot of righteous anger about how some things have been handled, but we need to make sure that we are really looking forward and thinking about how can we create things that are going to stand the test of time, not just because they'll be interpreted correctly in the future, but also because they're not just retroactive. They're not just looking at the problems we have today. They're thinking about the problems we may have in the world to come. So I think part of the issue of over-regulation is an over-focus and over-specificity on the problems of the last 3 to 5 years, and perhaps not enough attention to what the next 3 to 5 to 50 years could look like. And in particular, something that concerns me, and I'll take the Facebook example in particular. The internet is currently run on digital advertising. We have what I like to call, from the games industry, a free-to-play web. You can go on the internet, you can look at all kinds of websites for free in exchange for your personal data. And GDPR and actions taken have really, tried to help address this issue. But we may not always have an internet that is based on that business model. We may have microtransactions. We may have public funding. We may have a bunch of different models that haven't even been created yet. And when we over-regulate to the specifics of, for instance, the way that the business model of the internet today works, we might actually prevent those possible futures from existing. We may force the internet to forever be an advertising-driven entity. And to me, that's really sad. And so I think that when we are thinking about regulation and legislation, yes, we need to be specific. We need to not use these, oh, I know what you're talking about language and act a little bit more lawyerly. But we also need to act with a mind toward, actually, to the first question, what are we losing when we assume this model of operations? What possible futures are we closing off? Not just the bad ones, but potentially the good ones too. And think about how we can use the language of law to shape those possible futures, to make them more probable into coming into being. So I don't think it's too much regulation. I think it's not the best kind of regulation, and no dishonor to it's incredibly hard. I don't pretend to have the answer. It was very hard writing this talk. I put it in there, but there kept being news stories coming up, and I kept having to change my slides. You know, I was like, oh, I need to take a break from lunch today so I can change my slides again. It is a fast evolving thing. So my understanding is that today's transformer generative models are not sentient systems, but as Timnit Gebru and Meg Mitchell have said, and many others, the fact that someone could believe that, that's concerning. I'm not particularly concerned that Lambda is a sentient AI. I think that if you look at the architectures of it, you can kind of understand how predictable it is compared to how frighteningly unpredictable people can sometimes be. But it doesn't matter, actually, to me, if it is sentient, as much as it matters that someone could believe that, because if we're living in a world where technology is convincing enough to be an entirely separate being, to have a mind of its own, right now we're living in a world where, you know, we're not just talking about fake comments. We might be talking about entirely synthetic relationships. We might be talking about things that people believe that may be incredibly deceptive. Now, a part of me, and I said this at a futurist at a Foresight event one time where someone was saying, you know, well, what if we all go into our own little private virtual reality utopias and we don't interact with each other and we all just like feel good all the time? And I was like, that could be okay. I don't know. Like, I'm not saying that it's wrong. You know, if you want to have a relationship with an AI, like, go for it, by all means, right? Like, there might be new ways of experiencing the world that are funky and frightening and new, and they might be totally fine and even healthy for people. But if you don't know, if you're not sure that that's an AI, if you don't have the transparency and explainability, the trust, that you understand what this system is and who controls it, to have a critical lens to who is creating this and what their incentives are, that's a dangerous situation. So to me, the concern about Lambda AI is not so much one of, is it sentient? I personally don't think so. I also don't think that that's a particularly meaningful question. I think it is pretty concerning that it's believably sentient. And I think that looking at it from a disability justice lens, I think it's also dangerous when we start to ascribe rights and agency to technologies before offering that to some human beings. So I also think it's really important that we not get too excited and carried away with these things before, like, looking at our own house and making sure that we're actually, you know, besides giving an AI a lawyer, that we're making sure that the human beings around us, the sentient beings around us, have those rights and dignities.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions from the audience or online? My colleagues want to add some other things? Well, if not, the Academy and the president had a very nice idea in giving a present to be a very significant present, because it's the book written in Latin, but it comes with a translation in English, so no worry. A book by Luigi Galvani, the one that discovered the effect of electricity on animals, is certainly among the most distinguished member of this academy. And the reason for which I think is particular, and of course is the reason that inspired the president, is that the title of this book is The Effects of Artificial Electricity on Muscular Motion. So as we know, electricity was the driving force of the second industrial revolution after the invention of the engine. So these artificial things are changing our life, and this is a piece of history and especially an important one. So with the congratulations of the Academy, I want to give this to B with our best wishes. Thank you, and thanks for this great occasion, great talk, and thanks to my colleagues as well. There are no other questions. I would just thank the speaker again.